While a misconception prevails that the lives of the rich might coexist harmlessly, if ostentatiously, alongside one's own, and the opportunity for elevation exists if only one were to simply hustle enough, the world of Final Fantasy VII, and most poignantly the City of Midgar, throws into focus how a disparity between rich and poor has deep-seated implications on economic liberty and individual agency, which, if left unchecked, becomes a systemic, entrenched, ever-broadening gulf from which a tenuous society ever struggles to reconcile. Indeed, what Final Fantasy VII's infamous City of Midgar highlights, right down to its very design, is that, at a fundamental level, rich and poor alike are competing for the same resources. The Midgar plight is a dystopian spectacle that quite literally elevates those with means away from those without, permitting those above to not only better housing, space, and living standards, but access too to resources as fundamental as sunlight, while others are left to toil below with unhealthy proxies. This makes Midgar a spectacle of juxtaposition, a city which on paper at least may be an economic powerhouse and one of the enviable superpowers of the world, which yet masquerades a third world majority and increasingly dire living conditions for most who live there. It is a fitting metaphor and perhaps artistic counterpoint to objectivist philosophies proposed by the likes of Ayn Rand, who believed in self-interest as a form of achievement and one of the highest moral virtues, and rejected selflessness, collectivism, and altruism as nothing more than weakness. So how does this happen? What conditions combined to create Final Fantasy VII's most compelling dystopian society? And why do the extremes of Final Fantasy VII's dystopia leave such a lasting impression in the mind of the player? Jumping right in, the major player behind the arrangement of Final Fantasy VII's world, economic conditions, and perhaps even geography is the Shinra Corporation, a monolithic megacorp which is presented as ever-grasping in its pursuit of wealth and power. Beginning life as a weapons manufacturer, Shinra discovered Mako as a means of energy production and rapidly capitalised on the discovery to become the largest energy supplier in the known world, which, as stated, is another of the fundamental resources upon which society, and particularly modern society, relies. Now, Final Fantasy VII, and Shinra specifically, is sometimes regarded as a metaphor for capitalism, or late-stage hypercapitalism, where government regulation over business is significantly reduced. But really looking at the status of Shinra, it's less the scenario of business being deregulated by government than it is business becoming the government. Indeed, capitalism by its nature relies on principles of supply and demand, but also of competition, where power ultimately resides in the consumer's ability to choose. Shinra works very hard to flout these principles, to become a monopoly of industry, which is perhaps best glimpsed in Barrett Wallace's backstory in the game, where the private enterprise of Shinra convinces the collectivized denizens of Corel to abandon their competitive industry of coal mining in return for the promise of jobs and convenience that Shinra's energy supply will provide. However, as the denizens of Corel soon find, one of the many shortcomings of a market monopoly is bad faith actors who, once dominating a marketplace, have very little incentive to maintain their competitive edge or levels of service which so wooed their consumers in the first place. Nibelheim, Corel, and Gorgaga are three such casualties of Shinra's monopoly, where, in the relentless pursuit of profit, failed to maintain their reactors to even the most basic levels of safety, leading to mass casualties in several of these instances. The monopoly and astronomical profits gained by Shinra permitted it a financial foothold in the world that allowed it to diversify into other spheres of industry and influence. It built the City of Midgar as a base of operations, it branched into space exploration, military, and media, and from here converged the realms of business with governance to shape the world as it saw fit, which is to say, to maintain and expand its hold on profit and resources and consolidate a social order where they are firmly on top and are largely subsidized by the remaining 99%. And to this end, the City of Midgar is once again a spectacle of this monopoly and industry, where each essential resource is privatized, the property the people live in, the land it's built on, the taxes paid, and most of the employment undertaken is all owned by or in the service of the company itself. It might be fair to suggest that the people of Midgar would have mixed feelings about this, and yet part of the genius of Midgar's design is not just the towering centrepiece of Shinra's headquarters that might equally fill one with trepidation or ambition, but perhaps too the existence of the slums of the Undercity, which are just visible enough for middle-tier employees to consider that it could be worse. Additionally, and perhaps more importantly, is the thin veneer of personal choice that still exists within Midgar itself, exhibited by characters like Mayor Domino, who, while an elected official on paper, is a self-described mayor in name only that serves only to offer the illusion of agency for those that live, work and vote in the city. Beyond the political arena lies Shinra's influence over all things military and judicial, with the suppression of dissent being evidenced not only by the Midgar itself being a police state, but further afield in both Junon and Wutai, with Junon's citizens being dispossessed by the company who decided to build a city on top of their homes, and the latter being a self-determinate nation-state who rejected the ruthless expansionism and overtures of the Shinra. Indeed, as Tacitus once wrote, the more corrupt a state, the more numerous the laws, and Shinra's actions leading up to and throughout the story of Final Fantasy VII exemplify the quashing of dissent and erosion of the social contract, in which true sovereignty and liberty should reside in the people themselves. But perhaps most powerful in Shinra's ascent towards control is its influence over the spheres of social communication and media, and indeed it's often said that those who control the media control the message. Shinra proves entirely adept at shifting the Overton window of debate away from its own accountabilities in eroding civil liberties and commandeering resources by creating enemies and objects of dissent for its citizens to rally around. The aforementioned Wutai is firmly posited as a foreign other, an alien nation intent on harm, and part of the cause for the awful living conditions of the people of Midgar. Yet more convenient still is the eco-terrorist group AVALANCHE, who prove a consistent candidate for blame, and in the instance of the Sector 7 bombing, which was amplified and capitalised upon by Shinra, it proves an ample opportunity to shift blame while further opening opportunities to tightening laws while rallying the people around Shinra as a saviour. The perpetuity of Shinra makes Final Fantasy VII one of the bleakest examples of a dystopia in modern gaming fiction. Indeed, even as Barrett Wallace breathes a sigh of relief early in the game upon discovering that Shinra Senior is dead, Cloud is quick to retort that the president has a son, evidencing an autocratic pseudo-monarchy in all but name, and as the events of the later game show, Rufus is an individual intent not on altruism, not on redistribution, but doubling down on the status quo and the legacy of his father to maintain an ironclad grip on the world through fear. Turning to the real world, the Russian Revolution of 1917 was a watershed moment in modern history that came about as the autocratic rule of the Romanov dynasty and the advent of industrialization pushed the peasant classes and the gulf between rich and poor to a breaking point, with the fruits of labour and the profits of technology flowing ever upwards to the Tsar and the privileged few. The ensuing revolution and establishment of a communist government would likewise go on to claim the lives of millions. So, just as Newtonian physics suggests that actions have equal and opposite reactions, so too do civilizations operating at socio-economic extremes often give way to proportionate and equally extreme responses, which explains, after all, the actions of AVALANCHE throughout the events of Final Fantasy VII in response to the environmental, economic and military actions of Shinra. It was perhaps Winston Churchill who said it best when he suggested that the inherent issue of capitalism is the unequal sharing of blessings, while the inherent virtue of socialism is the equal sharing of miseries. A fitting quip, perhaps, from one of the most famous centre-right politicians of all time, but it strikes at the very heart of an essential dichotomy and question as to whether one can truly find balance between ambition and altruism without floating in either direction towards the extremes. The tail end of the 19th century saw the wealthy Cadbury family establish the model town of Bourneville in the south of Birmingham, an experiment in British enterprise which was designed to house the employees of their chocolate production business. Rather than replicating the cramped living conditions and paltry wages endemic to the working classes of Victorian England, the family emphasised designing space for both life and leisure. They pioneered offering above-average wages and subsidised healthcare, and fiercely advocated for health and fitness among their workforce by creating activity and outdoor spaces in this experimental town, believing wholeheartedly that a healthy workforce is a long-serving and satisfied workforce. Bournville proved a resounding success, and remains an aspirant town in the UK to this day, and pioneered philanthropic business practice and urban planning revolutions across the country, which became known as garden cities and persist to this day. It does perhaps serve a glimmer of hope, a sound example of where evil absolutism of free enterprise, which is so often depicted in dystopian fiction and brilliantly captured by Shinra in the events of Final Fantasy VII, doesn't necessarily need to become the reality and the natural conclusion of such an economic model. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the episode, please consider joining me on Patreon. Alternatively, if you feel like donating me a coffee, you can do so. The links are available below.